Thank you so much. Again, let me just express how exciting it is to be here and share my work with you. So I would like to give special thanks to Leslie, Hewitt, and Omar, as well as the rest of the people involved in making this talk possible. Today, I want to share with you the work of Achchowen. That is a group of indigenous Mayan women who are performers, and they hail from Solola, Guatemala. Before doing that, I want to also just acknowledge that we are on the indigenous lands of the Kumeyaay here in San Diego. As you know, this is more than just a performative acknowledgement, but I think it is important to note that these lands are unceded territory. And with that, I just want to also give thanks to today's energy in the Mayan calendar. Today is Kan, Gablahufkang, which is knowledge, or one of the expressions of knowledge in the sacred calendar. I would like to also explain before getting into the work at hand of discussing the Mayan women's play, Ishkik, that I will spend some time talking about Kabawil, or what is literally translated as the double gaze, just to give you a sense of how pre-colonial marks in the form of glyphs allow indigenous artists and particularly Mayan women performers to participate in world making. In my book, Indigenous Cosmolectics, I think about Kabawil as an indigenous epistemology, but also ontology, and I will demonstrate how it works and changes across time. By turning to Kabawil as a pre-colonial epistemology, it allowed me to reach beyond what Mark Rifkin calls settler colonial time, but also a Gregorian calendar temporality, or even the telos embedded in nation states that constitute what I call Mesoamerica. The term or the concept of the epistemology, or the name for a leftist organization, as I will show, also allows me to recuperate Mesoamerica, or to reclaim it as a geographical space that historically did not adhere to current geopolitical borders. Recuperating the term from its anthropological and archaeological use allows me to define a literary space that was necessary to think beyond or outside of the chronology of the nation state. Nation states are, in Latin America, roughly about 200 years old, whereas Mayan and Zapotec nations and their pre-colonial marks are over 2,000 years old. These pre-colonial markings are indeed everywhere, and they become important references to today's literary and artistic expressions. As I hope it will become clear, these pre-colonial markings allow contemporary Mayan cultural agents to articulate a more just world, or at least to struggle towards a more just world. Some of you may be wondering, what is the relevance of these pre-colonial markings for rethinking Latin American literary historiography? Or at least that is kind of the question that I set out to respond to in my research. I think for one, it is critical to recall that within the nation states of Latin America, indigenous people are not seen as producers of artistic expressions. National literatures in Latin America, for example, have always been seen as part of a larger European Spanish tradition. Second, I think it is relevant because with these new performances and writings, indigenous peoples demonstrate that they continue to grapple with colonialism. That is, we are not in a post-colonial state, but this political status is not and should not be ground zero for discussing or engaging with indigenous knowledge. These pre-colonial marks also illustrate that there is an ongoing struggle for knowledge production and representation, and that these are not abstractions or removed from political struggle, as I hope to demonstrate. Lastly, perhaps, in Latin American literary studies, in order for us to move beyond the discourses of mestizaje, hybridity, and transculturation, which have been the dominant ways of thinking about social, literary, and cultural relations, we need to move beyond these if we want to be in solidarity with indigenous struggles. In that light, what I do is I trace Kabawil from its representation in glyphs, which in the research that I have done is grounded in the direct and retrograde movement of planets. So Kabawil represents the planet Jupiter in retrograde. And I would like to share my PowerPoint with you now. And in this slide, you have different representations of Kabawil in the early classic period. And as you can see, they are distinct, and it shows or demonstrates that Kabawil changes throughout time. And these representations also hail from different parts of the Mesoamerican region. From its emergence in the pre-classic, we can tell that it has gone changes from the pre-classic to the post-classic to the colonial period to the 20th century. And what we see here is that not only does it visually undergo changes, but also in its connotations and denotations. But what is clear is that Kabawil has always been in conversation with the cosmos and society. In its contemporary deployment in the 20th and 21st century, it commands similar but vertical and horizontal movements. Kabawil surfaces in pre-classic Mayan glyphs with a smoking mirror glyph, which is this figure 7.4 here on the slide. And in other representations, you have Kabawil being represented as a serpent with an axe as a foot. This is a scene from a vase. In classic and terminal classic representations, Kabawil's foot is usually substituted by a serpent, usually thought to be the god or a representation of the god of writing. In the post-classic, the serpent foot representation continues, but with a new variation that includes birds, wings, beaks, and claws. In other archaeological records, Kabawil is referenced as the god of divination, a Mayan Prometheus, or simply as God K. Mayan kings often added the glyphs for Kabawil along their names to denote a sacred genealogy, whether they ruled in Tikal or Honduras, as in the case of this Copan ruler, Washakun Ubakawil. And it allowed them to establish a genealogy that went back thousands of years. So it was a way of authorizing themselves, adding literally God-like Lord by using the glyphs for Kabawil. In other representations, Kabawil is associated with corn, maize, or other vegetation symbols. In ceramic art, Kabawil can be read iconographically as a metaphor for corn. In many incense-burning vessels found in Palenque, Kawil is said to function to integrate two opposites or complementary halves of a larger idea. It was also sculpted as a representation of power. Let's see if I have it here. Don't have it here, but it used to be a representation of authority being passed down. As you can imagine, all of this history changes with the Catholic eruption into the Mayan population during the 16th century. And I will not get into how this happens, but you can turn to my book if you're interested. But I do want to mention that in the 20th century, Adrián Inés Chávez considered the first modern Maya Quiché intellectual to revisit the Popol Vuh, which is the 16th century sacred Mayan Bible, if you will, or some people have called it that. He linguistically and culturally translates Kabawil as the double gaze. He recovers this cosmolectives and describes it as it being two visions at the same time, to see in darkness and in lightness, to see close and far, a double gaze. It is a compound word that is formed by ka, meaning to, and the verb will, meaning to see. Kabawil's transformation from its glyphic etchings in stone and painted replicas in codices to its present significance suggests a relationship with the cosmos that goes back to the pre-classic era and is a resistance to the experience of coloniality in Mesoamerica today. In its late 20th and 21st century deployment, Kabawil straddles spiritual practice, politics, gender, aesthetics, philosophy, and social experience. This Tabasco flask, for example, the glyphic writing here says that it was a gift to the lords or the rulers in a small village in El Salvador, and this was found in one of those ceremonial centers. Here, we can see Kabawil being woven by women in their traditional clothing, and Kabawil takes on the representation of a double-headed eagle in many of the textiles. And as I mentioned earlier, it also becomes, and you can see here the double-headed eagle in the right corner, becomes a political organization in the 20th century. And when you see, when you look back to the founding of this organization, it talks about how the organization is founded after the model of being able to see double. And here they include also lo bueno y lo malo, the good and the bad, up and down, the future and the past. It is a strategic philosophy in that way. In relationship to the women's theater troupe, I argue that Kabawil facilitates an interpretation of how the performers embody multiple temporalities at the same time. They do so literally by impersonating female ancestors and other Mayan women activists in the present. This multiple temporality allows them to rewrite past history and record the feats of activist women who will not be part of the official annals of the nation state. Kabawil, or the double gaze here, allows women to redress the past and underline women's agency. The group emerges in great part as an initiative from the Tzotzil High Cultural Center. Leonardo Lisandro Warkash Gonzalez founded this group in 2001 and pushed for the founding of the center. This cultural center has national and international recognition as being one that focuses on art production that is informed by ancestral knowledge and inspired by pre-colonial sources that are recorded in the Dresden and Madrid codices, among others. The founder offered artistic representations that transcended national borders, making Maya art and performance visible, not just in Central America, but also Europe and the United States. In 2010, the shocking news of his brutal murder circulated widely in different media venues. Most coincided that unidentified men had kidnapped him, and he was the third victim in his family to be slain. So as you can imagine, this resonated with the activists and the genocide that Mayan people suffered in the 1980s. The police investigations into the crime might have met the same outcome as countless other unresolved assassinations, but due to international pressure, the authorities announced the arrest of the alleged kidnappers. None were affiliated with government-sponsored militia. The men were sentenced to lengthy prison terms in 2012. The motive driving Wakasha's slaying may remain opaque and dismissed as part of the post-Civil War sea of violence engulfing Central America. But his widow, Clara Alicia Sen, the leading actress in Actuen, maintains that he was murdered as a result of his cultural activism. Wakash's legacy thrives through the cultural center, as well as through the women's theater group, as their name honors his last play of the same title. Clara Alicia Sen, his widow, has taken on a leadership position within the center, as well as in the theater's group. The first thing that I wanted to learn about the women was, especially considering gendered cultural expectations, how they managed to come together. And I traveled to Solola in 2014 to talk to them about their process. One of the things that they talked about was how their work was modeled after scenes in pre-colonial markings, such as vase, codices, and a lot of the movements that they make are also reproductions that they have seen in these pre-colonial markings. The way that they decided to organize this play was based on these models that they would see. And I was really struck by the fact that they had not actually attended theater productions themselves. So in effect, what they were doing was circumventing the traditional letter city, which is how most of us think about Latin Americans' literacy and city connection. The play has been presented in different regions in Guatemala, other Central American countries, as well as the United States. At the time, I was not focused on differentiating theoretically between theater, performance, dance, song, or drama. I struggled instead with whether to use their terms, such as Kai, which I concluded from our conversations that in practice, what they were referring to had more to do with corporeal movement and song than traditional thinking about plays or theater. As they explained, Kai connotes seeing, movement, and entertaining an audience. But in the end, I opted to use these terms interchangeably, as did the women performers at the time. Thinking that Indigenous performances are not necessarily informed by European theater is important. And I agree with other critics that see theater as having colonial connotations. But I also think that Indigenous acts need to be analyzed in ways that problematize the assumption of theater as having European origins explicitly. It was striking for me that the performance had never seen a play in a form of theater, but did not hesitate to call their work a play. In this context, this play represents an epistemological undoing as it untethers elite assumptions about theater production and performance. In revisiting their performance for today's talk, I thought about how ritual becomes critical in their delivery of this play. In rethinking their work as involving ritual, it allows me to also think about how they are blurring temporalities by invocating past women heroines. The rituals evoked here are part of the mise-en-scène, but they are not necessarily disclosing sensitive or sacred information. Instead, they are staged to stimulate and move the stories forward, but also invoking the spirit of the ancestors. Through the ritual, the women invoke these pre-colonial markings and ancestors. It is through this invocation that Kabawil also becomes an ontology through which the group carves out for itself a new conceptual, cultural, political, and social stage. Kabawil here patently manifests through the play's attempt to obviate common binaries attributed to indigenous and Western worlds, such as oral, written, tradition, modern, passive, active. In particular, it invokes the past and relates it to the present, thus overcoming temporal discontinuities between the ancient Mayan civilization and the women's contemporary identities. The longitudinal and lateral moves offer an important revision of the ways that nation states have romanticized the classical Mayan civilization while ignoring the present state of indigenous peoples. It contests the official historical claim that the Maya had disappeared by the time the Spaniards arrived. The modern state of Guatemala was constructed by establishing Mayanness as part of the past and contemporary indigenous peoples as simply a vanquished Indian group. Kabawil then allows contemporary Mayan artists to make claims of both an ancient and a present civilization. More importantly, it allows women to claim agency today. Cultural advocates evoke Kabawil as an ancestral paradigm that becomes useful in thinking about gender relations as well. Hence, the concept of Kabawil offers a critical lens in examining the play because it allows the audience to view Mayan struggles in a historical continuum. It functions as an analytic tool that allows indigenous women to speak to gender and ethnic relations. As the Quiche feminist Alma Lopez notes, not all aspects of traditional culture are compatible with indigenous feminism, but she would recuperate Kabawil. For her, it is a central philosophical concept, a vision that encompasses all aspects of consciousness, expanding the temporal and spatial plane. Lopez proposes that to apply a Kabawilian lens means that women own and understand all of the terrible conditions they endure and change them, while owning and evaluating all the positive things they do have to transform. It entails realizing that not everyone is the same, and that diversity exists among women along ethnic and class lines. Lopez synthesizes how this analytic lens corresponds to contemporary social relations between men and women, indigenous and non-indigenous women as well. Of course, the women performers do not think of themselves as feminist. Indeed, when I ask them, they reply that they do not see their struggle as separate from that of men, but that it is women who have to fight because social inequity affects them directly. Nonetheless, I interpret their play as a feminist intervention against neoliberal capitalist ventures, because in the play, it is the women who repudiate extractivism, represented in its symbolic use of the womb as a natural resource, and the Cabot-Williams strategy of alluding to another story within the main storyline. Ishkik, the title of the play, incarnates a Cabot-Williams philosophy in its connection to pre-colonial markings, but also to the 16th century sacred text, the Popol Vuh, and its relevance in contemporary neo-colonial issues such as extractivism. Ishkik has been translated as Lady Blood. Blood is the essence or spirit of the ancestors. The performance's title strategically alludes to the 16th century sacred text, but it is not simply a retelling of the original story. Interestingly, in the Popol Vuh, Ishkik is not very central. In some ways, her role is minor, but by titling it Ishkik, Achjowen honors her rebellious spirit. In the play, Ishkik's role is not central, as are all the women. Achjowen's play also deviates in other foundational ways from the Popol Vuh, or the sacred text. In the traditional version, Ishkik is the daughter of one of the underworld lords of Xibalbá. She gives birth to twins, Hunahpu and Ixbalamquech, who are represented as male in classical Mayan iconography. In the play, Ishkik is pregnant and gives birth to a It is noteworthy that the prefix ish is always associated with women and weaving, but in the play, her fate is to be a leader. Another striking difference between the sacred text and the play is the grandmother, Ishmukane. In the sacred text, Ishmukane does not represent the nurturing and welcoming mother-in-law. Instead, she questions her daughter-in-law's truthfulness in claiming to carry her grandchildren. Perhaps the most compelling deviation from the sacred text in the play is how the forces of the underworld, or Xibalbá, are represented. In the play, Xibalbá represents business, making the play a bit anachronistic, if you will, but relevant to a contemporary audience familiar with extractivist issues in Guatemala. Achjowen animates the 16th century text by turning it into an allegory that directly alludes to political struggles in Guatemala. 20th century politics and pre-Columbian cosmogonist struggles coalesced in this performance. Mayan women's resistance across temporal, geographic, mythic, and historic lines become palpable in the specific political events they allude to from the past as well as in the present. The play becomes what Macarena Varis de Gomez, in a different context, terms a decolonial gesture. But in the 21st century, Mayan women struggle against a different underworld, a different hell, if you will, or at least some people have translated Xibalbá as hell, as the hell here is represented by neoliberal forces, embodied by mining companies bent on extracting gold and silver from Mayan lands. Unlike traditional plays, Achjowen's performance does not neatly divide into different acts or scenes, and the story unfolds without any breaks in between. The characters do not enter or exit the stage. The unborn daughter, for example, is visible to the audience, and I'll show you some of these images. Oh no, why is it not showing? Let me try to go back to the PowerPoint. I'm just going to make it larger this way. So if you can see, this is the daughter, and she does not exit. We can see all of the action. The grandmother and Ishkik are in the background, but the audience can see all of the characters. We can see the daughter being moved as a result of the grandmother moving her around, because as I will explain, she is breached. Come back to that. The singing and drumming in the opening scene also invoke the ancestors, particularly the female line that is represented by the grandmother or Ishmukane. Alan J. Christensen notes that to the Mayan Quiche elders, reading the ancestors' names out loud is believed to bring them back to life. The actresses do not translate the songs or most of the dialogue, but the audience understands them to be an invocation of the grandmother. Her spirit then is summoned through the play. The main action takes place inside a pre-Columbian sweat lodge where Ishmukane, the grandmother, is the healer and the midwife, all sort of pre-colonial associations of Ishmukane. The play tells the story of the grandmother and the daughter-in-law. The plot unravels when the grandmother realizes that Ishkik's unborn daughter has to be repositioned as she is breached or set to exit the womb feet first. Ishkik lies near the fire for the ritual. The ritual consists of prayers near the fire. The grandmother lightly passes branches over her body. During the ceremony, the mother has a vision that the dark forces of the underworld want to murder this unborn child. She wants to return to the underworld, but her grandmother refuses her and tells her that she is too rebellious, that she can't go back just because she wants to. Ishkik convinces her by asking the grandmother to think of the generations. Ishmukane acquiesces at last and returns her to the underworld through this ritual. The impetus driving the story is a stake in the future, as the daughter's death would endanger the imminent leadership of Mayan women. Ishkik battles against the Lord of Xibalba to save the daughter. She transfers her unborn child to another womb, presumably someone in the audience. Symbolically, the fight continues in the hands of other women, even though Ishkik has to die. Ishkik, in effect, sacrifices herself so that her daughter would live on. In that sense, she defeats the underworld's plan to prevent her daughter's future leadership. The most compelling couple-willing strategy worked in the play is the way other Mayan women's voices resonate in the struggle against Xibalba or the underworld. The dialogue between Ishkik and Ishmukane establishes an inherited feminine rebellious nature. In the sacred text, Ishkik defies her father's prohibition about approaching the calabash tree. In Ishkik's dialogue with her mother-in-law, she directly references the fight against mining companies trying to displace communities from ancestral lands to make room for extraction machines. And I want to just quickly play a short clip to give you a sense of what the play looks like. Try it again. This is her trying to go back.
Tenía que cortar los cables de electricidad para que esas máquinas pararan.
This is the most intense and dramatic segment of Ishkik's monologue. She screams, "I had to cut the electricity cables so that the machines would stop working." She continues, "Those people are contaminating my hair, my bones, my womb. My seeds will not sprout. Those men are invading my womb." In the first few lines, another story within this story emerges, and it becomes a key element in the play. Ishkik transforms her body into a spatial and racial geography that is grounded in a struggle for autonomy that speaks to the legacy of colonial forces and the present violence of neo-colonial capitalist ventures. Those lines that she speaks are probably unfamiliar to most people. But in those lines, Ishkik alludes to the story of Crisanta Perez, a Mam woman who, with the support of others, obstructed a Canadian mining company's operations in her village. Known as the Gold Corp 8, the women were arrested for obstructing the mining company's productions. According to Perez, the mining company had asked her for permission to allow a cable to pass through her property, but did not ask for her consent to install an electricity post in her backyard. In a short interview, Perez writes that with the help of other women, she caused a short circuit, stalling the mining company for days. The machine stopped working and no one could figure out what had happened until they realized that the power had been cut off. Following the company's discovery of her action, the police arrested Perez, but the entire town stepped in to defend her, thus saving her from prison. The women argued that the mining company tricked them into selling their lands. This is the gaze toward the present established through Akjoan's work. Ishkik from the 16th century simultaneously embodies Crisanta Perez in the 20th century. I just want to also quickly play another clip for you to meet Crisanta Perez. And her description of what happened.
Pesado, pues, por tantos daños, por todo lo que nos había hecho la empresa. Entonces fue cortar la energía eléctrica de la empresa. La casa está cerca del poste, ahí está la casa y ahí está el poste. Pasamos un alambre encima de esos cables y solo con eso se cortó la luz. Y la empresa se quedó sin energía eléctrica. Ella solicitó apoyo.
In the play, the dark forces of Xibalbá are a constant pre-Columbian reference. The personification of Xibalbá as a man or a male in a business suit reminds us of the present. Xibalbá wears a business suit. It also reminds us of modernity, the West, patriarchy, and more explicitly, foreign mining companies. At the same time, the Lord of Xibalbá signifies the Spanish colonizers, as his mask is that of a conquistador, and the weapon that he wants to use to murder Ixbalanquiec is a spade. The other actress's attire is reminiscent of classic Mayan clothing and textiles. The flute, drum, and whistles replicate pre-Columbian instruments. The narrative thread represents a gaze toward the past. The gestural and corporeal movements by Ixkik and Ixbalanquiec evoke dance movements captured in pre-Columbian sources, thus embodying and embedding Kabawil in the performance. Actual's play represents a montage of the struggles of past and contemporary modern Mayan women. Its performance illuminates a movement from past to present and vice versa. Evoked here is this double gaze that allows Actuen to reference the sacred and the secular, the ancient and the present. In Guatemala, the play is read as transmitting an anti-mining company message. Well, in the US, it just becomes another cultural production by women. The work of Actuen redirects our understanding of how Indigenous identity and everyday practices are affirmed and contested across temporal, spatial, and linguistic grounds. The power of this performance lies in its cabahuilin expression, a double optic, one that allows cultural producers to disembody binaries commonly associated with indigeneity. Undoing these binaries enables Indigenous writers to carve out their own subjectivities and activate a set of cabahuilin epistemologies that have been obscured by colonialism. In other words, this undoing does not deny any material and cultural influences in the work of contemporary Indigenous artists, or disregards mixed heritage. Rather, it affirms an intellectual legacy that has been systematically denied to Indigenous people in what today is referred to as Latin America, but that Indigenous intellectuals rename as Abya-Yala, or Land of Eternal Spring. Cabahuil as an ontology moves Indigenous cultural agents closer to a more autonomous future based on more equitable relations. And before I move to answer any questions, I wanted to give you a sense too of how cabahuil, as I tried to show, has changed from the pre-classic moment to the post-classic, to the colonial, to the contemporary. And I wanted to show you a clip of a rock group named cabahuil that I see as also embodying this philosophy, not just in their attire, as in their attire, they reproduce the double-headed eagle, but also in the kind of mixing of genres that you will see. Nakasa chanta kudwe chwawena o. Okay, and with that, thank you so much for your attention to this talk.